In this session, we're going to look in a bit more detail at Agentic. And to help us do that, we're joined by Daniel Del Moro, who's Director of AI Automation and Innovation at UiPath, who happen to be sponsoring us today and hosting us at their offices. Daniel's also a fellow graduate of Heriot-Watt University, fantastic, which is where I graduated. So very pleased to be speaking to you today, not just about automation, but about Edinburgh too. But before we get on to Edinburgh, Daniel, I wonder if you could help us just understand a little bit more about what we mean by agentic automation and how it is different from the robotic process automation that.
Perfect. Yep. And welcome to our offices. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. So indeed, when we talk about AI, there's a range of different things that pop into people's head when we talk about AI. So in the 90s, AI for me, when I worked in the document processing space, was around, can we read handwritten information? And we thought we were at the cutting edge back then, but boy, have things changed since then. So UiPath, the company where I work right now, has really been a leader in RPA technology for many years. And when I looked 10 years ago at the solutions we used to provide, it was really about removing the mundane, repetitive work that people did in offices in their day-to-day lives. So data entry, copy, paste between different systems and applications. But as the time progressed and our offering and the space around RPA changed, the question really became, do the robots and the people have access to the data that they need? Because quite frankly, if we're using RPA robots to move data around, it needs good data to start off with. So we talked increasingly about intelligent automation, which focuses in on being able to extract the right type of data, the data that we need from documents and communications. So that was, I suppose, just 3-4 years ago, where that became an absolute crucial player in the success of RPA. But where we are now, of course, is a very different area again. We're talking about Gen AI, generative AI, which brings a whole new set of capabilities to those RPA robots. But your question is specifically about agentic AI, agentic automation. What is that? Well, it's about using an agent, and we define an agent as, actually in my mind, I liken an agent to a new employee that you may hire within an enterprise. You sit them down, you give them some instructions about what they're going to be doing. Because you don't trust them yet, you give them a very limited set of tools that they can use to get their job done. You give them access to standard operating procedures, guidelines, best practices, and they're expected to do their work. If they get stuck, they can ask their superior for help. And when we define an agent, it's a very similar process. You give it natural language instructions, a goal in essence, and you give it access to standard operating procedures, guidelines, best practices. But you also give it access to an escalation point, back to a human. So an agent, because they're powered by Gen AI, are able to make sense of that data, not just move it around like RPA robots, but to make sense and then help us as people make better judgments, because it can really provide us with insights into that data that can be useful for our judgments. So they're very, very useful for complex decision making. Now, what we see, and I'll come on to this perhaps later in the discussion, but it's not necessarily agents replacing the traditional robots, but actually a partnership between the two, working together because they each have their own strengths, as do people. We'll come on to that, I'm sure.
Could you give us some examples of common use cases that bring this agentic agents to life?
Absolutely. So whenever we talk about use cases now with agentic automation, we like to talk about journeys, and that is end-to-end business processes. Whereas I guess RPA really focused in on improving task-based operations. Agentic automation, which is also the addition of RPA in that mix as well, looks at those end-to-end journeys. So let's just take an end-to-end example. So invoice matching. And with invoice matching process, you get an invoice coming in, You might cheer because you've got RPA extracting data from that document, inputting it into the payment systems, and ultimately triggering the payment to be made. But anyone who's involved with or has done any sort of invoice matching knows that there's a degree of complexity in there as well, because not every invoice is valid or has the right line items or is described in a different way or different expected quantities. So traditionally, we've needed people to determine what the issues are in that invoice matching process, determine a resolution, perform the resolution, and then hand off back to the robots again. Now, a good example, therefore, of an agentic process is where we use an agent or agents in the middle of that process, handed off from the robots to perform the investigative research into that invoice, into the back-end finance systems, and then actually propose a resolution to a human for them to approve or reject, suggest another alternative. So it's this handoff between robots to agents to perform some analysis, understanding of the problem, determine a resolution, and having people to approve of that before handing back to the robots again. So what I'm describing is a mix of those different players in an end-to-end business process. And there are many, many, many examples, of course, as you might imagine.
Can we just for the sake of the audience, because what you're actually describing is very simple for you, and actually it's probably simple for us as well to understand as well. But actually, RPA, turning into agentic automation, Gen AI, ML. Actually, if you go back to 2020 or 2019, this is not vocabulary that was just everywhere. And the consumerism since OpenAI, Anthropic have all come to market, Grok, Gemini, the consumerization of AI has actually, I will say, given a very interesting slant on an industry that has been around for 20 years, right? But the naivety in the marketplace around actually what automation is, or UiPath in its own right, actually this business has been around for well over 15 years. And you take for an executive team to understand that timeline, could you summarize it for us from your perspective? Sure. Just because I think it's really important we set a foundation that actually what we're talking about isn't really that new, right? And there is a lot of fear factor that goes along with the marketing, with the provocative messaging that's out in the internet. And I think it's really important that there's some stabilization in the underlying technology, especially, and I'm sort of going on a little bit, but it's important because I talk to so many businesses as part of our natural outreach, to bring UiPath to the market. And actually, the amount of people who question the reality that RPA existed before 2020 or before OpenAI came to market is astounding. Actually, it's really interesting. So just again in your words, if you wouldn't mind just summarising just some of that timeline from your perspective, would be fantastic.
Yeah. So if we just look at AI in itself, so AI has been around for ages, years and years and decades, right? So, but AI was always focused on specialized training. So AI for very, very specific needs, like, beating Kasparov at chess, right? Or other quite exciting, sensationalist experiments that were done in the public. And those were kind of exciting. And as I mentioned, in the 90s, when I was doing this document processing stuff, we had AI that could read handwriting. But that's all it could do is read handwriting, read the difference between the letter A and the letter B, etc. It was absolutely unskilled at anything else that we now class AI capable of doing. So AI was always on a mission to, I guess the workers in the AI space have always been on a mission to provide more and more capable systems that could do not just a very narrow range of tasks, but to open it up a little bit. Now, what happened with the large language model revolution that OpenAI really became famous for with ChatGPT is really training it up on language, which is phenomenal. And what we've ended up with, and I guess anyone who's ever typed anything into a ChatGPT style interface, is there seem to be no limits to its knowledge or its capabilities. You could ask it just to report back to the Heriot Watt days again. If I wanted to find out more about physics, quantum mechanics, as I studied years ago, I could easily type into a prompt, tell me about quantum mechanics, but in the style of Dr. Seuss, and that's great. It could output that. This is mind-blowing stuff. But the question is, and I think in everyone's mind, certainly in business right now, is what's the value of that, right? So it's impressive and it's kind of fun, but what's the value? We can empower our employees with the ability to have an assistant on their desktop that they can type questions into. How do I do my tax return this year? Or how do I file my expenses? Or what's a good strategy to manage my team in this particular scenario? It's great. You can ask it these questions and it can give you hints. But actually measuring the value of that is very, very, very difficult. And this is the challenge that enterprises have right now. An MIT study just recently indicated that, yeah, everyone's playing with AI in some form or another, Gen AI systems at the moment, but 95% of pilots are indicating that the value is very difficult to measure, or they're not seeing any real value. And that's a big question on a lot of execs' minds right now. Yes, we have exciting technology that we can use, but what's the measured value? And that's what we're trying to help.
Yeah, and and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a line between generative AI and what it can do. But then if we take agentic automation, and there is definitely a convoluted view that they're the same thing, right? And when we talk to, and this comes back to that education point, right? And especially with large, big enterprises, and we'll probably come on to it, but it's really about the education point of the change in adoption of whether it's agentic automation or AI. And it comes back to that ideation of value creation that you're talking about, is actually what are we trying to create and do in our business? And actually, is it AI that we need? Or is it some smart agentic automation that sits within our operation or within the business? From your view, how should a board educate themselves?
Yeah, okay. So we can talk about the difference a little bit initially, but also that education point is key, because so Gen AI, what is it? It's a capability that can understand language. It can respond to inputs using its vast amount of language training. So it's, in essence, it's a form of a brain, right? It can understand inputs and provide outputs based on that. What is an agent? Well, an agent has that brain, but it also is capable of doing things as well. So it has access to tools. So it's a brain with arms and legs, if you like. Now, the capability of those tools varies wildly depending on the type of agentic automation you're talking about. And we'll touch on that a bit later as well. But it's understanding that Gen AI by itself probably has limited value.
Next to none in most cases, really. Unless it's marketing or sales outreach or curating a better response. Actually, outside of actually doing something in a business, Gen AI actually doesn't have a place, really, right? which is a huge misconception.
And I think it's really important to, when we do talk about agents, just to make that distinction that, yes, an agent has as its brain Gen AI. It also has access to company-relevant standard operating procedures, best practices, guidelines that can help control its behavior. In the same way that when, as I mentioned earlier, with a new employee, you want them to be doing things the best way, not just based on the experience they've carried from somewhere else. You want them to conform to the way your business works. That's what that context is really necessary for an agent. But increasingly also, there's a lot of worry about agents going rogue, right? So sure, if we give it tools and we've given it a brain, well, surely it can go off and do anything it wants to. But it's, and I want to touch on that point specifically later, because that's really, really important to a lot of listeners, is how do you control an agent? And actually, it's a question all about guardrails, selection of the right tools. So if you do want an agent to make sense of your emails and act as an email triage agent, fine. Reading emails is one tool. Writing emails is a separate tool entirely. So you wouldn't naturally give it access to the ability to write emails. And that's quite important. I'll come on to the education piece as well, right? So I think that remains a big challenge, because there is a competitive pressure with every enterprise to do something with Gen AI, or do something with Agentic, because it's perceived that their competitors are also exploring those avenues. And it is important to ensure that you do have internal talent to help understand what the capabilities are, but crucially also to implement them and apply guardrails around them as well. And I think that just running small pilots here and there with AI just to test the water is fine, but you do need to start to think about operating model and strategy. Again, we can touch on those.
A bit on Agentic now, Daniel. You said earlier on there's a bit of a question mark sometimes over the tangible value that is delivered by AI, but I think Agentic is one of those technologies where there is some measurable benefit, even if it's an efficiency gain, not necessarily a cash gain yet, but there's an efficiency gain certainly. And I think there's hundreds of potential applications of how you might use Agentic on your processes. So when you've got a new client who's just starting on this journey and they've got this vision of hundreds of ways that they could use Agentic moving forward, how do you help them decide how to prioritize and sequence those use cases that they start their proofs of concept with?
Great question. So with any implementation of any new technology, you always want to consider two axes. One is amount of effort that you need to invest in this thing, and then the perceived or expected value, right? So you've got the low-hanging fruit, which are low effort, high value, okay? Those quick wins, the low-hanging fruit. But there's a lot more to this story with Agentic as well. So when we talk to our customers and we have, for example, Agentic discovery workshops where they come in and we try to flesh out ideas, we go through an ideation process. We also, let me phrase it this way, it's incredibly rare to have customers who have a completely greenfield approach to AI, and by that I mean Agentic, and automation. They've done some form of automation in the past. They're toying with different Gen AI frameworks and Agentic frameworks. So it's very rare for them to say, right, clean slate, we're gonna find some ideas, we're gonna build them, and we're gonna run with them. They've already started to toy around with different Agentic frameworks. If they also have, in addition, some form of established automation program, we want to be able to reuse that as well. We don't want them throwing RPA out the door and saying, let's just go with Agentic. That is not the answer. So there's a much faster time to value here, which is look at processes where you already have automation, so a brownfield approach. Look, what are those processes where we're already benefiting in some way from automation? Where are the points where we can make further improvements with the addition of agentic? So what we tend to do is we go from end-to-end process to end-to-end process, and we say, let's really investigate this one. Okay, we see there's 3 or 4 points where you've got RPA performing some tasks with benefits. The points in the middle are usually points where humans need to really act and perform some really complex decision making based on the data that's moving around. Those are usually ideal places to start to investigate. Can an agent help there? And what you end up with is an end-to-end process design, which includes the established proof points from RPA, for example, additional areas that you can start to investigate with agents. And by the way, throwing agents at everything is not a good measured value point. Agents can be expensive to operate. And there may be opportunities where there's a further exploration of RPA, right? So it's mapping out what that end-to-end process looks like, which bits continue to be RPA, which bits are new agents. And then we've got a measured cost of that process currently. And then you can start to say, well, okay, let's run a POC just for this area over here and see how that improves the end-to-end process. But there are a lot of businesses, as I mentioned, are trialing or running pilots or running explorations with agentic tasks right now. So they run a small pilot, which is, let's use this bit of agentic technology just for this task. That's fine. It might prove results. But that task is, of course, part of a much larger end-to-end business process. And it's very difficult to measure the value of just that task compared to the end-to-end.
And you're talking about the challenge of scale then?
Yeah.
Right. Which is actually, if we're thinking for, higher mid-market, FTSE 250, even 100 actually, some of the customer people we've been talking to, the challenge is actually, how do I move out of those pockets of proof of concepts and then scale with them? Even more challengingly is those pockets could be leveraging different tools. A lot of the time, not necessarily off the shelf, but they've borrowed a bit of tokenization from OpenAI, a bit of Anthropic in there as well. And then it's like, okay, well, where does the governance come from? Where does the guardrails? Where do the ethics? Where does everything sit, and who owns it in the business? Which then starts to become, it's your favorite thing, how do I tackle my operating model, right? What would you say to a board that's in that point? What should they then start to think about?
Okay, so let's say that they are running a set of different pilots with different technologies, each with their own development life cycles, each with their own development skills required and costs, etc. Remember that in the 80s or so, in the 90s, we had the ability within Excel to do macros. That was exciting, right? So, the exciting times. Suddenly, we could empower business users to build their own clever spreadsheets. But where's the governance in that, right? So, and we're facing increasingly a scenario where, with multiple pilots with different technologies in the agentic space, it's very difficult to control and govern how those pilots run collectively across the enterprise. What an enterprise needs is some form of, and we call it orchestration, right? So some ability to step above all of those individual tasks or pilots and say, how do they link together? How can we control or at least monitor the operations that are happening in each of those different pilots? But crucially, back to the value point, what's the value end to end? So you kind of need like an AI trust layer, let's call it that can govern what developers can do, govern communication to external Gen AI providers. Because if you're playing with different technologies, they are each individually, of course, calling their own technology vendors, the hyperscalers out there that are providing these technologies. How do you control that? How do you look at the auditing, the logging across all of those? How do you prevent leakage of sensitive enterprise data to those providers? So you need that layer in between, which can control and govern that, and that leads us, I think, quite nicely into our trust layer, yes, but also an orchestration layer that helps you link all these things together and manage them as a set of individual pilots, true, but up to a level that you can better control.
Wholeheartedly. Yeah, I'm glad you went there, because that's where I was hoping I was leading you into. Because actually, I see orchestration as probably one of the biggest conversations at scale, wholeheartedly, and the underappreciation of the amount of tools that are out into the enterprise, and even down into smaller mid-market, and actually even worse in SMB, where they're bringing in all sorts of stuff and playing around with, which just increases their threat exposure, right? For an enterprise today, looking at all of these POCs and pilots where they are spending considerable amount of money, and actually you saw a stat earlier on around MIT, I think it was MIT you mentioned, leveraging something. This is it's a direct plug for UiPath, really, to understand is, from an orchestration perspective, how quickly can a business regain control of that orchestration across its enterprise or across its different business units? And how quickly could they get value out of understanding the impact and the widespreadness of all these POCs and pilots in their business by bringing in orchestration?
Yeah, okay, let's cover that. Before I get on to the time element, it's probably best if we define what we mean by orchestration, because sure, we've mentioned it, but I think for the listeners it's worth knowing what that means. So what is an orchestration layer? Well, I mentioned earlier that it's very likely when you start to embark on an agentic automation journey that some parts of it are absolutely agentic. Some parts are going to be traditional automation that you already have built or very easy for you to build quickly. You also have people. We're not removing people entirely. People are absolutely necessary as escalation points. I mean, even take the EU AI Act, right? Which stipulates that AI should not be making decisions in place of people, right? So what we need is some way for agents to be governed and controlled, or to escalate to people to make the final judgment calls. So if we imagine that end-to-end business process where we do have traditional robots, new agents, and people all working together, how the heck do we manage those handoffs between all those different players? And that's what the orchestration layer is. So picture a BPMN flow, right? You've got all those the tasks, you've got the decision points. Imagine mapping that out and configuring each box to be an RPA workflow being triggered or an agent being triggered. Now, of course, at UiPath, we'd love everyone just to use UiPath agents. The reality is, of course, they're trialing all sorts of different agents out there. Well, I think it's very important that enterprises have a vendor agnostic approach to their agentic automation solution. So we don't care actually if they use our agents or third-party ones that they've already built or are playing with. So getting back to that point of how long it takes, Well, if they're already experimenting, they just need to be able to configure this end-to-end orchestration canvas, this BPMN flow, to trigger those agents and have it trigger then to the next step. Very, very, very quickly. So mapping out a flow, an end-to-end business process, you can type in a prompt that says, give me, back to that invoice matching example, give me an invoice matching process, and you give it some information within the prompt. Bang, it creates you a process. Maybe you've already got a BPMN diagram for your end-to-end business processes. Great, upload that, bang, we've got that. You just need to then configure that. Very, very quick turnaround. We do agentic workshops where by the end of the day, we've built a flow, we've configured agents. Whereas in the beginning of the day, we didn't even know what the process was that we were walking into. Incredibly fast turnaround. But that then provides that level of governance and control of the use of those agents. So incredibly fast turnaround.
So you talked about your ideal situation being vendor agnostic, Daniel, and I fully agree with that, by the way. But I think sometimes there's a bit of a danger in organizations that they perhaps pick some technology quite quickly to start with. They go through proof of concept and then they keep developing and developing, and then all of a sudden they're locked into a technology. So it's probably quite important for them to think carefully about that technology choice up front, because it's going to have longer term consequences. So what would your advice be on how to choose a agentic technology? You know, what are you looking for in that technology? What sort of features, what sort of characteristics should businesses be focused on?
Yeah, great. So yes, that you're right. That vendor agnostic approach is vital. And I don't just mean from the agentic side of things, but if you're building agents, you need or would benefit from the ability to switch which Gen AI providers actually providing the brain of this particular agent, because the technology is moving so fast. I mean, we build out use cases, those end-to-end journeys with agentic automation, and there are parts of that end-to-end process where we have one provider doing one task with an agent and another provider doing another task with a different agent. Why? Well, just we find that some hyperscalers work better in certain scenarios. That may change next week, right? Because the technology is evolving. So a key thing is the ability to have an agentic framework that allows you to switch out at different technologies to keep up with the best technology out there. Now, the second thing I would say is that level of governance, right? So when an agent is running, it gives you usually quite a comprehensive view of what it's doing. You also need it, quite crucially, to provide you with the reasoning as to why it's making decisions. When we start to implement these agents in real-life enterprise-wide systems, that auditing is vital. And so you need good transparency of the logging and the audit trails that exist. It's vital, absolutely vital. The next is you need an agentic solution. We mentioned what an agent is, and it's a brain with some arms and legs. And the arms and legs we call tools, okay? So it might be, with a real person, it might be a screwdriver or a typewriter or whatever. These are tools. With agents, their tools might be the ability to read emails. It might be the ability to enter data into a mainframe system. It might be the ability to pull data from some of the enterprise enterprise solutions like Salesforce or ServiceNow. So a tool might be, can I pull data from those different systems? A lot of those tools are API based, but there's a lot of additional types of tools that you would need, like the ability to use RPA. So choose an agentic provider that also allows you to link with traditional automation means as well. There are probably a few other criteria as well, but those are the things I would say to focus on.
Okay. And when you're starting out this agentic journey, what are the dependencies and prerequisites that you're looking out for that mean that you're going to be able to get benefit from this tool. So as, for example, if you need a ERP of a particular maturity so that APIs can link to it, or do you need a data set that's well developed enough so that you can get value out of the Gen AI module? So how mature does that business need to be to get started?
Yeah, so it will depend already on their automation maturity. So if they do have a strong automation maturity, and by that I mean they already have some RPA processes in place, that means that they can start to link agentic technology to their legacy applications and systems, which is great. That isn't always the luxury that enterprises have. So if they do have legacy systems and applications in use that don't have APIs, and they don't have RPA to connect to that, then they will need to rely on the more modern cloud-based API systems and applications that exist out there. A lot of our customers, of course, already have a pretty strong RPA automation maturity already. So for us, it's about plugging them into existing automations that they've already built. There's the whole concept of operating model as well. So thinking about an operating model of how an enterprise exists, how an enterprise performs, I should say, its end-to-end processes. A lot of those processes are built with humans in mind. When you start to automate, it becomes quite evident that this human-designed process is ready for improvements, new efficiencies. And you need an operating model that can evolve and change over time for that. You need good inclusion of subject matter experts to be involved in the creation of agentic automations. With old-style traditional automation, you would naturally have the subject matter experts, the business leaders, to create a requirement, pass that essentially to the business analyst to flesh it out, then to the developers to build, and then that to the testers to test and then deploy back to the business. What we're seeing with agentic automation is actually those subject matter experts can stay much more involved in the process all the way through. Why? Because, well, first of all, it's a lot faster to get to the end result. And second of all, quite often, they are the people who design how that agent operates. It's not code anymore, it's natural language. So in the same way that you can define a job description for a human, you can define, or they can define a job description for an agent as well. And so that I think, just on the requirement side of things, making sure that you have an environment where those subject matter experts can work alongside the developers to build those agentic solutions is, we're seeing, a must.
So this falls to me as citizen development in line with. So, and I'll like to just explore my thought process, because I know I'll probably use it in the wrong way. But over the previous 3 episodes, we've had a chairman for a PE business who talks about his own AI agent called Neville, which is like his digital twin. We had a CPO talking about change and adoption and the challenges that businesses have around educating people at scale who have been hit so hard by the marketing element that as soon as you mention automation, they're like, oh no, my job is out the window. And then we've had Mark O'Ryan, who is he's a published author who talks about AI and leadership a lot. And one of my key takeaways from him actually was all talking about the AI whisperer in the organization, right? The guy who likes to, or gal, that likes to dabble, but is a subject matter expert in their field, but then dabbles into that development world of, as you said before, building out a process based on natural language. The rate, I'd just be interested in your view around touch on those. If we take those 3 and then combine it into a single challenge point, which is actually documenting process from end to end, that does in most enterprises go across different business units, right? and how agentic actually helps pull out natural efficiencies in those processes, but yet you still rely on those individuals within those departments to create the nuance within those processes that need to happen. But actually, and I'm also going to pull in the orchestration layer back into that as well, because actually the orchestration layer allows people to go and create and automate their own little worlds, and then you start to get visibility of actually people using automation across the business, and then which I class as citizen development. I know it's probably in the wider world probably wrong, but that's what I would class it as. But then the agentic layer over the top of that can pull all of that together, and to me that starts to create something which was also coined actually in the previous, which is a synthetic workforce, right? And I just wonder, do we do enough as part of, does UiPath do enough? Does the partner world do enough to help educate that piece of, which I would call fundamental actually in that change and adoption process for businesses to adopt quicker? Because when we look at, sorry, this is getting longer, but I apologise, but when we actually look at and we talk to, like we've had the most success not selling to technical people at all in conversations around professional services and transformation. And I'm wondering where does UiPath play within that space? Because a lot of the time actually it's not a technical conversation at all, and it is actually the knowledge sits in people, it doesn't sit in IT, right? So I'm just wondering, where am I talking reality? Is everything I've described a reality, or is that a utopian view?
So there's a huge amount of change management potentially in this discussion, right? Because it's interesting you brought up the concept of citizen development there, and I gave an example a bit earlier around Excel macros, right? That you're empowering people to create their own stuff that they find useful, but where's the governance in that? And I then, in the latest example, talked about involving subject matter experts in the whole development cycle, because it's easier for them to help the automation team build those solutions, because they're describing their own tasks in effect. It will, I see, start again. I see why that could be considered to be citizen development, but what we don't want to be heading towards is a situation where people are freely creating agents for their own use, again without governance. This requires that level of governance across to make sure, again, we're putting guardrails in place around what an agent can and can't do, what citizen developers can and can't do. And that's why it's so worthwhile elevating the conversation to end-to-end business flows, because we look at agents performing tasks that are part of a bigger picture. And yes, we use subject matter experts to help form the agentic pieces in there that have those tasks automated. But we still absolutely have the involvement of the automation team, the IT team, security team, and an AI team as well to help manage that bigger story. That there is always a citizen development conversation to be had, but unless you have a strong governance layer in place, it's not going to be effective. And UiPath insists upon that governance layer. And yes, it ties into the orchestration layer as well, but it controls what individuals can and can't do in their automations. And that's fundamental to have in place. So it relates back to the that conversation a bit earlier around having small pilots running, doing small things. It's difficult from a value perspective, but it's very difficult from the governance perspective. And you asked me if UiPath and partners are doing enough to help get that message across. Well, I think, to be fair, we're all learning right now around what is good and what is bad agentic development practice. And what we're trying to put in place is that trust layer, an orchestration layer that makes it safe to experiment, but brings the control centrally.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually the perfect answer. And the only reason I raise it is obviously the previous two guests have been CISOs who love to ring the alarm bells of risk, right?
Yeah.
But security naturally doesn't have the answers, right? And and they are about guardrails, but actually the technology is moving so rapid that frameworks actually are redundant at this point when we think about in the context of how quickly especially agents have come into the world of everything that we do, and I wanted to and I'm glad you did, which was reiterate that orchestration layer piece, because it is a fundamental step which I think a lot of businesses are missing, especially around security, understanding the effectiveness of what they're trying to achieve, and that central intelligence platform as well.
There's another interesting thing that we do here. So when we run these agentic discovery workshops, and I mentioned, yes, absolutely, let's bring in the subject matter experts because they know those processes best. But we also, in the best run workshops that we've had, of course, subject matter experts, automation teams who have already been building out traditional automations, because suddenly they can say, actually, we've got bits and pieces of the jigsaw that we've already built that can be incorporated. Great, that saves time. We also get the AI teams involved because they're an inquisitive bunch who want to know what technologies and capabilities these new players are bringing to the table. And in fact, our story is that because we link in with all of the top brands of Gen AI systems out there, that starts, of course, to get very interesting to the AI teams. But crucially also the security teams, so to bring it back to that. Because the security teams need to have the ability to view this orchestration layer and to make sure they're comfortable that all those guardrails are in place. So a good, strong team involving those different types of persona is a winning formula, not just for an agentic workshop, but going forward. And quite often we're seeing in enterprises that struggle, there's an automation team, and separately, sometimes they've never spoken, an AI team, separately, and they've never spoken, a security team, right? And where we've seen the best results is where they are either combined into the same, the same team, or they have good cross collaboration, because it appears the sum of those individual parts is way, way stronger and more effective and more valuable, faster time to value than the individual parts held separately. So having those teams collaborate is crucial.
I guess in having all of those stakeholders involved, there's a danger of creating sort of death by committee, isn't there? And I suppose what you need on top of all of that is some kind of transformational authority that drives them towards outcome and kind of cuts through some of the noise and the discussion and the theorizing.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely right. And that's good to point out. If there's a strategic team that can work above them to guide them, to align them and point them in the right direction, that's beneficial.
Still at a reasonably nascent state, especially in that mid-market where there's perhaps lots of proofs of concept going. There's some promising results emerging from those proofs of concept in terms of theoretical efficiencies, which still need to be productionized, which I guess will happen relatively swiftly. So if you look forward 3 to 5 years, Daniel, how do you anticipate the state of play looking in that horizon? And how do you think the technology is going to further develop?
It's a really funny question, right? So you're saying 3 to 5 years, which is not a long period of time. And actually, just to tell you a story, so my father worked in the 80s, and he was often asked to produce a view of what technology would look like in industry in 20 to 30 years' time, which was hard, but it feels like we're faced with an equally hard problem of what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 years' time, because things move so... Exactly, right? That something else is released, or some new framework, or some new guidelines, or governance, or regulation that controls things. So 2 to 3 years is still incredibly hard, but we all know what the direction is. If you think back to COVID, where everybody had to work from home, suddenly we were completely reliant on being connected to the office, or being connected to our suppliers for food and medication and all of that. And it became very much an expectation that we can do anything online and be serviced incredibly quickly. So that trend will continue, but it's getting to a state now where the bottlenecks in enterprises are people wading through huge, vast quantities of pretty much unstructured data. We've had RPA, and that's been providing and will continue to provide huge benefit with repetitive, mundane tasks, removing those. But what we're seeing with Agentic is agents helping people wade through that vast quantity of unstructured and complex data to help them make decisions quickly. So we're seeing these end-to-end business processes, which may previously, a few years ago, have taken years. A few years ago, would have taken days, being reduced down to potentially hours and minutes. So that there will be an expectation for customers, vendors, suppliers, employees, that end-to-end processes get processed quickly and easily without fuss. That's where the technology, of course, is heading to supply that need. And yeah, it's very difficult to say exactly what that would look like, though.
Sorry, that's another far out there question. But I heard, so, and actually, it was actually, I can't remember who said it to me. But AI, excuse me, sorry, coughing down the microphone. AI and agentic automation, and I'm going to broad stroke generalize it here just a little bit, because I think it is a little, there's a thing we forget about, and that's actually once AI and agentic automation is in our business, what does our business look like? Because if I'm on at the top of the board, actually it enables us to achieve far, and you talk about, time to value and how quickly all of a sudden a process that takes 3 or 4 days, all of a sudden now we're doing it in minutes. What does my business look like when I have every process touched by automation or AI in some way? Actually, what does my operating model look like? What does my brand look like? And I don't necessarily think businesses, or actually us as humanity, are actually quite ready to have an answer for that yet. Which in its own self is going to start causing problems, I reckon, in the next 18 months. Purely because of the fact of the rate that the deployment we're going through. How should, and it's probably, I hope it's not out of your remit, well, I hope it is out of your remit, then it's a genuine answer, but how should, when executives are ideating to bring in intelligent automation, that they should start considering what their business will look like afterwards? Because you are a stepping stone to that vision. right? And it's a really important one, especially. I'm talking really almost a little bit bigger actually. It's actually, well, what is my business if AI and automation sits across it? Because business today is a people business. Every business is run with people. So, and it's not about what do I do with those people. It's really about what do I do with my business, and actually what can my business achieve now that it has automation in it. And that's where I'd really sort of want to go with it. It's not the negative side of mass layoffs already and that type of stuff. It's actually, well, now I actually have the capability to touch any system at scale. I have the capability to market at scale. I have the capability to productize, to supply chain, I have all this knowledge and capability now in my business's fingertips. What do I do? And does the concept of a business in its current frame still exist?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? And yes, there's a whole discussion around operating model. How do we manage that? And I think the enterprises that are treating this just as a cost-cutting exercise, sure, it's going to be, but I think it's about new revenue generation, new sources of revenue. Certainly a big discussion now, right? So how can we explore new opportunities, new sources of revenue? How can we not just keep up with the technology brackets or our competitors, but how can we actually strive ahead? And agentic automation is providing some great new opportunities that were completely out of reach before. And the focus has traditionally been on, can we keep up with our customers? Can we keep up with our competitors? And this is now empowering businesses to be much more open to innovation, much more reactive, able to react. And yes, of course, there's a whole discussion around how you manage that redistribution of work from people to a mix of people, agents, and robots. Sure. But I think I see that personally as an incredibly exciting place to be in the future with those new opportunities. Just from a customer perspective, as a customer, I interact with many businesses and for their services. We all do. But understanding how that will look even in 2 to 3 years, it's pretty mind-blowing.
So I guess wrapping up and taking everything we've talked about into account, you're advising a CEO who is looking at this phenomenon of agentic and thinking, all right, well, what are the top 3 things I need to internalize to understand this better and to be able to benefit from it? You know, what are the things that you'd advise them?
So yeah, first, I would try to step up above. I would try to step up from thinking just about improving certain tasks across my business. Really step up and go above the trees and look at where the direction you want to be heading in is, because you will have a series of end-to-end business processes that can direct you in that there. And agentic automation can play a massive part in helping those end-to-end business processes become a lot more streamlined, a lot more efficient, and a lot more beneficial to your customers and your suppliers. It's yes, of course, there are cost savings there as well, but the are great opportunities going forward. So yes, think bigger than just task-based improvements. That's the first. The second is look at technologies or frameworks that give you flexibility in the future. So yes, of course, try out different pilots and different technologies, but try to wrap them up in some form of an orchestration layer that allows you to experiment freely, but with governance and security at its heart. And the third thing is be bold, quite frankly. Everybody is, of course, looking at agentic automation. Everyone's looking at Gen AI. And it is something that you should be looking into. But reach out to UiPath's partners, of which there are many, to help you. Yep, there we go. Reach out to UiPath partners to find out more, because this is a journey that can be embarked on very, very, very quickly. It's important you involve the best people within your business, and I include absolutely subject matter experts, AI people, and IT. But get onto the journey and, experiment.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel. Really good.